Van Halen was one of the biggest rock bands of the 1980s. Screeching, vibrating guitar riffs driven by pounding bass drums. At the heart of the band were two brothers. Given a strong introduction to music from a young age, they directed their talents to the world of rock and roll. Their innovations would change the sound of rock music forever, selling millions of records, catapulting them into the Hall of Fame and continuing a musical dynasty that continues to this day. Welcome to Behind the Music. In this video, we dive into the roots of the Van Halen brothers and the story of how their relationship, experience, and determination took them from outcast immigrants to become rock and roll gods.
By playing 5 hours a night, 5 days a week at different bars and clubs, sweating it out and so-called paying your dues.
The Van Halen story began in Holland when one family moved to America. The year was 1962, and waves of Europeans were landing in the United States looking for better opportunities. The Van Halen patriarch, Jan, was looking for musical prospects as a jazz musician, playing the clarinet and saxophone. There were slim prospects in Holland and hoped he would find greater success across the Atlantic. However, it was an uphill battle once they arrived in the States and made their way to Pasadena, California. For one thing, none of them spoke any English. Lugged along with their cargo was a piano. It turned out that Jan's vision wasn't a reality. After playing at some well-known clubs, he realized that music wasn't going to pay the bills. Instead, he worked odd jobs to support his family, dishwashing, cleaning, and any work he could find. Meanwhile, his young sons Eddie and Alex were having the cultural shock of their lives. They were darker skinned than many of their classmates since their mother was from Indonesia. This made them the target of bullying and discrimination at a time of racial integration. Forced to play with black classmates who had the same experience, Eddie and Alex grew closer together than ever before. What they shared most was music. Their father had trained them in classical music from a young age, both piano and guitar. In fact, Eddie's middle name was Ludwig, after Ludwig van Beethoven. Their mother, Eugenia, forced the two boys to be disciplined in their training. Having been through financial hardships because of her husband's volatile career, she was very resistant to her boys chasing the same dreams. This was part of the reason that they were instilled with foundations that would lead to more stable careers: classical music. However, over time, both boys broke away from classical music, just as their father had towards jazz. For Eddie and Alex, it was increasingly towards rock and roll, inspired by the music of British bands Cream and Eric Clapton. Eddie began playing the drums, even saving up his money from a paper route to buy his first set. But it was Alex who picked up the drums quicker and was soon obsessed. Eddie drifted away from his first instrument and towards the guitar instead, taking every spare moment to practice, refusing to meet with friends, and spending lunchtimes jamming instead of socializing. This commitment was transforming Eddie into a young superstar. Their first band was the Broken Combs, while they were both still in elementary school. The two continued playing through high school, fine-tuning their crafts until David Lee Roth approached them to be their lead vocalist. David Lee Roth was influenced by a more eclectic mix of folk and rock from Sly and the Family Stone to the Rolling Stones. The Van Halen brothers, who were known as Mammoth, preferred the heavier rock of Deep Purple and Black Sabbath. Roth convinced them that he was the missing element in their band, joined by bassist Michael Anthony around the same time. Roth also persuaded them to change the band's name to reflect what it really was: Van Halen. By the time Roth and the Van Halen brothers united, they had each developed small followings. Combined, this made for a considerable fan base. They played at local parties, gatherings, and events, becoming a staple for the young neighborhood party scene, but their ambitions were much bigger. They branched out to clubs, festivals, and park shows, some of which attracted thousands of people, through Los Angeles to West Hollywood. Securing a residency at the club Gazzarri's, which was where the Doors had made their name, Van Halen was ready to break on through. Gene Simmons from Kiss helped them put together a demo tape. Soon after, one of their gigs was attended by a Warner Bros. Records executive. After hearing their music, he immediately offered Van Halen a deal. In 1978, Van Halen recorded and released their first self-titled album. It was a hit, giving them a platform bigger than they'd ever experienced. By the end of the year, they were opening for their heroes Black Sabbath and getting to work on a second studio album. Van Halen only became bigger, performing at the U.S. Festival in 1983 for a staggering sum of $1.5 million, which would be over $4.5 million today. Van Halen was touring constantly, only stopping to record albums. 1984, released in that year, came to be one of their most successful albums of all time, going 5 times platinum after only a year. Tracks included the hits Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher. The album would have made it to number 2 on the Billboard charts if it weren't for Michael Jackson's Thriller. Their heavy metal sound, fused with searingly high vocals and innovative guitar work, was groundbreaking for the industry. Success was coming like never before, but behind the scenes, artistic differences were reaching a boiling point. Van Halen became infamous for one of their technical riders where they requested a bowl of M&Ms with all brown pieces removed. They were blasted as being rock divas for it, but they later explained that it was a test to see if the venue had complied with their technical demands for lighting and sound. Their show was visually demanding, and a lot of this was directed by Eddie. However, Roth, in line with his earlier musical influences, wanted to take the band in a more pop-oriented direction. Eddie stubbornly refused. He was determined to make the band sound heavier. These two visions were ultimately incompatible. After the 1984 tour, as Roth's solo career began to take off, he left the band. While the charismatic frontman Roth was gone, the heart of the band remained. Roth was replaced by Sammy Hagar, and the band continued to even greater success, releasing hits like Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams. Tragically, the man who started it all, Eddie and Alex's father, died in 1986, but was able to see his 2 sons skyrocket to global fame. Van Halen released 5 more albums, 2 of which went gold, but they never recreated the immense popularity of their early days of the mid-1980s. Van Halen has sold over 80 million records worldwide and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for their contributions. While some argue that parts of Van Halen now look cheesy or corny, the band left a huge mark on the music industry. Eddie is considered one of the greatest guitarists of all time, both for his playing style and his inventions. From a young age, Eddie Van Halen was modifying guitars to perfect their sound. This experimentation produced the Frankenstrat and the Superstrat that became widely popular among rock musicians. He even patented a flip-out support device to get a tapping sound out of his electric guitar. Eddie pioneered what was called the Brown sound by modifying a Marshall speaker in what he had said was an attempt to replicate the snare drum of Alex. These sounds were replicated for decades and came to be synonymous with the 1980s rock and roll scene. Unfortunately, years of partying eventually caught up with him. He became a functional alcoholic early in his life and went sober in 2008. But smoking contributed to his developing tongue cancer, lung cancer, and throat cancer before he died in 2020 from a stroke. Eddie is survived by his wife and son Wolfgang, who continues the Van Halen musical lineage, playing bass with the band for a decade and a half until his father's death. Alex Van Halen, who has managed to stay away from the limelight for decades, continues to maintain his privacy. Wolfgang has confirmed that the band has stopped playing together, stating that you can't have Van Halen without Eddie Van Halen. While that is true, the band created in the 1970s was more than just Eddie. It was also thanks to their inspired father. Jan Van Halen may not have found his own success in the American music scene, but he guaranteed that his 2 boys would have a deep passion for music and never give up on pursuing it. The knowledge he passed on to his sons formed the basis of an expertise that allowed Van Halen to experiment with rock, guitar, and the instruments themselves. That's it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth videos that go behind the music. We'll talk to you again in the next one.